For decades, most assumed interbreeding between our two species didn't happen.
As recently as 2010, ardent pure Homo sapiens proponents argued that the probability was negligible that any evolutionary significant genetic exchanges occurred between Neanderthals and modern humans. This statement was proven to be unequivocally false, and the theory has been rewritten to allow for interbreeding. The same paleo-anthropologists also questioned the interpretation of the Oase skull from Romania as having Neanderthal features, and instead suggested that it was just an unusually shaped modern human skull. Oase has now been proven to have a recent Neanderthal ancestor and 10% Neanderthal DNA. Silviu Constantin and Romanian scientists who analyzed the skull were attacked by the out-of-Africa theorists who believed that human species did not interbreed, which goes against the basic principles of biology. A recent BBC programme discussed this debate around the Oase skull from Romania, misleadingly stating that hybridization was shocking and unexpected.
Neanderthal Homo sapiens interbreeding, it was pretty controversial. People were just not ready to accept that. Interbreeding is not something uncommon in biology. It happens with other species. At that time, it was somehow taboo.
Far from being shocking or unexpected, hybridization had been theorized as the reason for hybrid traits in fossils for a century, until a certain dogma made it controversial. In the long history of paleoanthropology, ideas about human origins have swung like a pendulum between continuity and rupture. For much of the 20th century, hybridization was not a scandalous suggestion. It was ordinary. Anthropologists believed that closely related human groups, Neanderthals, archaic Homo sapiens, regional variants, would have interbred wherever they overlapped. The fossil record, messy and mosaic, seemed to demand it. Skulls did not fall neatly into boxes. Teeth, brow ridges, occipital buns, cranial vaults, traits blended and recombined across time and geography. The dominant frameworks, whether framed as multi-regional evolution or as looser models of continuity with gene flow, were built on the expectation that populations met, mixed, and exchanged genes. Then came a theory that changed the intellectual climate, the strict form of what became known as out of Africa. In its strongest articulation, this model proposed that modern humans arose recently and uniquely within an isolated African homeland, that they were behaviorally and cognitively distinct from all other hominin populations, that they expanded outward in a rapid dispersal roughly 60,000 years ago, and that they replaced Neanderthals and other archaic humans with little or no interbreeding. It was a dramatic reconfiguration of the human story. It did not merely adjust timelines, it proposed a clean break in ancestry. Modern humans were a new species born in isolation that swept across the globe and erased what came before. The case of the Romanian fossil from Pestera Siu Oase sharpened the rupture. Oase 1, dated to around 40,000 years ago, carried an extraordinary proportion of Neanderthal ancestry, with long DNA segments indicating a Neanderthal ancestor only a handful of generations back. This was not ancient, diluted introgression from some distant contact in the Near East. It was recent mixing in Europe itself. The discovery demonstrated that interbreeding was not rare, marginal, or confined to a single event. It happened repeatedly and close in time to the first arrival of modern humans on the continent. Media coverage often described such findings as shocking or unexpected. Some documentaries suggested that nobody thought interbreeding had occurred, but that phrasing compresses a complicated intellectual history into a misleading soundbite. It was not that nobody had imagined hybridization. Quite the opposite. For decades, hybridization had been the default expectation for many anthropologists. What was shocking in some quarters was not the idea of mixing itself. It was the degree to which the strict no interbreeding narrative had come to dominate public and academic discourse in the preceding decades. The shock belonged primarily to the most stringent out-of-Africa camp. For scholars who had insisted on complete replacement, the genomic evidence required revision. Many adapted, reframing the model as mostly replacement with limited admixture. Others emphasized that Neanderthal ancestry is a small percentage of the genome, preserving the broader demographic narrative while conceding gene flow. The field moved quickly, but the rhetorical whiplash remained visible. A story once told in stark black and white terms had to accommodate gradients. The deeper irony is that the radical element was not hybridization. The radical element was the insistence on total isolation and absolute replacement. In evolutionary biology, hybridization among closely related lineages is common. Wolves and coyotes interbreed. Bears hybridize. Even distinct primate species sometimes produce viable offspring. To imagine that anatomically and behaviorally similar human groups could coexist in overlapping territories for millennia without mating requires special pleading. Geography, climate shifts, and population movements all make contact likely. Biology makes reproduction possible. Complete reproductive barriers are the exception, not the rule. If one strips away the headlines and looks strictly at cranial architecture, the frequently noted proximity between Oase 2 and Shanidar 1 does not imply direct descent. But it does raise a more subtle question about continuity within a late Pleistocene contact zone stretching from the Zagros to southeastern Europe. Oase 2, dated to roughly 40,000 years ago in Romania, is genetically a modern human with a very recent Neanderthal ancestor, yet metrically its sagittal frontal arc, long and unusually flat for an early modern, falls squarely within the Neanderthal range and is closest, in published comparisons, to the frontal vault geometry of Shanidar 1. Shanidar 1, a classic late Neanderthal dating to roughly 60,000 years ago, exhibits the elongated low vault proportions characteristic of Neanderthals, and it is precisely this conservative cranial module, less environmentally plastic than facial projection, that pulls Oase toward it in morphometric space. The significance is not that a specific individual from the Zagros fathered a lineage in the Carpathians, but that similar vault geometries appear across a broad, Near Eastern European corridor in the terminal middle to early Upper Paleolithic. That pattern is compatible with repeated interaction among structured populations rather than a clean, isolated replacement. In other words, the Oase-Shanidar similarity may reflect a shared late Neanderthal morphotype circulating across Western Eurasia and entering early modern human genomes through local admixture events. When morphology and genetics converge, Oase carrying a recent Neanderthal ancestor while also expressing Neanderthal range frontal curvature, the case strengthens for a geographically expansive recurrent contact network rather than a single, neatly bounded episode. The continuity, then, is not genealogical in the narrow sense, but structural. A continuity of cranial form and gene flow within a connected Eurasian landscape where populations overlapped, mixed, and reshuffled long before later Upper Paleolithic groups stabilized into the patterns seen in subsequent millennia. The strict out-of-Africa narrative also leaned heavily on the image of Africa as a sealed evolutionary cradle, a kind of biological island from which modern humans emerged fully formed. But Africa and Eurasia are connected by multiple corridors. To treat Africa as hermetically isolated, while imagining that once modern humans left they could rapidly colonize Siberia, Australia, and the Americas, introduces a selective geography. Barriers are invoked when convenient, dissolved when not. As genomic data accumulated, the simplicity of the replacement story eroded further. Denisovan ancestry was detected in populations of Melanesia and parts of Asia. Additional pulses of Neanderthal introgression were inferred. Some early modern human individuals in Europe showed higher proportions of Neanderthal DNA than present-day populations, suggesting complex demographic histories with lineages that did not persist. Rather than a single clean event, the picture that emerged was braided: multiple contacts, multiple episodes of gene flow, population turnovers layered upon older admixture. The language of shock, then, reveals more about the sociology of science than about human evolution itself. When a theory becomes dominant, alternative expectations fade from view. Most people may encounter this simplified, whitewashed narrative in documentaries and think it reflects a long-standing consensus. When new evidence disrupts that narrative, it appears revolutionary. But the revolution often consists of returning to an older, more fluid understanding. Replacement was not a modest tweak to existing models. It was a radical hypothesis. Every pillar of it required extraordinary claims that Africa functioned as a long-term evolutionary island, that archaic populations in Europe and Asia contributed nothing of substance to later humans, that morphological mosaics could be reinterpreted as coincidence or convergence, that mitochondrial DNA patterns could stand in for the entire genome, and that the archaeological transition in Europe represented a sharp biological boundary rather than a porous frontier. Before this theory, hybridization had been widely entertained as a reasonable expectation. In the mid-20th century, when fossils like those from School and Kafsa in the Levant were debated, some researchers explicitly discussed them as possible intermediates between archaic and modern populations. The Levant was understood as a contact zone. Europe, too, was imagined as a region where populations ebbed and flowed with climate cycles. During interglacials, ranges expanded. During glacials, they contracted. Contact was not an aberration. It was inevitable. When modern-looking humans appeared in Europe, the idea that they might have absorbed local Neanderthals was not shocking. It was biologically plausible. Most models rested on gene flow as a central mechanism and argued that regional populations were connected by networks stretching across Africa and Eurasia. Under this view, hybridization was not an anomaly, it was the engine of human evolution. Even those who did not fully endorse continuity believed that complete reproductive isolation among such closely related populations would be unlikely. Neanderthals and modern humans shared a recent common ancestor. Their anatomy overlapped. Their ranges overlapped. Why would they not interbreed?
Modern humans would clearly have seen something very similar to themselves in these creatures that they encountered in this new world that they were entering.
This is why the later genomic discoveries caused such visible shock in parts of the field. When nuclear DNA from Neanderthals revealed that non-African modern humans carry roughly 2% Neanderthal ancestry, it did not merely add a footnote. It punctured a central pillar of the strict replacement model. The shock was not universal. Those who had long argued for gene flow felt vindicated, but among strong replacement advocates, the implications were profound. The clean boundary dissolved. If the core pillars of isolation, single dispersal, failed migrations, and near total replacement have collapsed, then the out-of-Africa theory is not merely revised, it is fundamentally wrong. Hybridization is no longer a peripheral footnote. It is woven into the human story. The early modern humans who entered Europe did not move through an empty landscape. They encountered Neanderthals who had inhabited those regions for hundreds of thousands of years. They exchanged tools, perhaps ideas, and certainly genes. Some of those early hybrid lineages vanished. Others contributed fragments of DNA that persist in billions of people today. When broadcasters declare that scientists are shocked to find hybridization in a fossil like Oase 1, they compress decades of debate into a dramatic headline. The surprise belongs to a particular theoretical moment, a period when replacement was framed in absolute terms. The broader history of anthropology tells a different story. For much of the 20th century, the expectation of mixing was common. The radical interlude was the insistence on purity. Science advances by testing its strongest claims. The strict no interbreeding model made a clear prediction. Genomics tested it. The result was an annihilation of the total replacement framework. The human story now appears less like a single triumphant wave and more like a braided network, lineages diverging and rejoining, meeting and parting, ancestry layered rather than linear. In that sense, the demolition of the strict replacement pillar of out of Africa is not a collapse of evolutionary theory. It is an enrichment of it. It restores complexity to a past that was always likely to be complex. And it reminds us that narratives, especially those that are clean, simple, and morally satisfying, should be held lightly. Human evolution was never a solitary march out of an isolated homeland. It was a long, tangled history of movement, contact, and exchange. Hybridization is not shocking. The idea that it never happened was the shocking idea. Thanks for watching.